Thanks, Geraldine. Thanks, Geraldine, and thanks for the introduction. And let me start by thanking all of the conference organisers for giving me the opportunity to come here to England today and to meet you and to speak at the conference. It's very nice to be back in the UK, where I'm originally from. I completed my forensic training over 20 years ago now, and one of my first jobs was as a prison psychologist at HMYOI Glenparva in Leicester, before I moved to Australia, where I've been working mainly in academic and research roles for the last 20 or so years. I wanted to start today by posing two questions and sharing, I guess, some of my observations about the area of practice that I'm going to refer to as correctional psychology. And this is a term that I use to embrace all of the work that psychologists do in both the prison and probation and parole systems, although my main interest lies in the broad area of offender rehabilitation. I want to start by suggesting that there's at least two questions that all of us who work in the area should continually be asking. First, how can we as psychologists best assist the justice system to provide constructive, humane and above all effective programmes? And second, how might we think about rehabilitation in ways that allows us to do this better? So perhaps just take a moment to think about how you'd answer those questions, and then we can see whether what I want to talk about resonates in any way with your experiences. I want to talk for about 45 or 50 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have time for some questions or comments or discussion at the end. Let me start though by saying a little bit about where I am now. I work in a university called James Cook, which has campuses in Cairns and Townsville in Australia, as well as one in Singapore, and is located in far north Queensland, quite close to the Great Barrier Reef. I just moved jobs from moving out of a School of Psychology and into an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Centre, which is a specialist part of the university. And I'm now focusing on research that's relevant to how we work with this population. For those of you who don't know, when I use the term Torres Strait Islander populations, that's a group of islands just north of Australia, between quite close to Papua New Guinea, which is a culturally distinctive group, an important group of people in Australia. And so quite a large part of what I want to talk about today relates to work that I'm doing, or the rehabilitation of those who from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural backgrounds. And I want to share some thoughts about how we work more broadly with disadvantaged groups, socially marginalised groups, minority groups, and how we should conceptualise this task. This is partly because there's a pressing need to close the considerable gap that exists across all areas of justice between Indigenous and non-Indigenous offenders, but also because the way I think about these issues has changed recently, and it's changed the way I think about offender rehabilitation more broadly. So my starting point is an observation that in Australia at least, the rehabilitation field's affiliation with a clinical treatment model has arguably constrained our ability to provide effective rehabilitation. And I say this as someone who originally left the prison service to train as a clinical psychologist, but has since come to believe that we need to think much less about individual psychotherapy and more about how we position our programmes within socially embedded responses to community safety. So to put this another way, I've come to the conclusion that we need to spend as much time thinking about how we change the familial, social and cultural context in which offending occurs as we do thinking about individual level change. And thinking about Indigenous criminal justice, for me, makes it very clear, at least, that the starting point is to return to some of the basic assumptions that we make, but perhaps rarely discuss, about why it is that people commit crime. And so I want to suggest that some of the failures that have arisen in our efforts to rehabilitate Indigenous offenders in Australia might also reflect correctional psychologists' shortcomings in appreciating the impact of the broader social and cultural context in which offending occurs. And so while some of what I want to talk about might seem quite a long way removed from where you work, my hope is that it'll provide some useful reference points for you to think differently about rehabilitation and apply some of these ideas to the way in which you work with your clients. It's important for me to say from the outset this presentation is very much about my personal experience, and others may well have different perspectives. I'm also not familiar with prison psychology here these days, and there are some rather obvious differences between Australia and the UK in terms of the history of the discipline, the way we train psychologists and how the criminal justice system itself works. But let me start by saying that Australian and British approaches to offender rehabilitation do have some common ancestors. a good starting point for me is to go back to the era of convict transportation. And most people will have some sense of the modern history of Australia as a penal colony. And in fact, between 1788 and 1868, about 162,000 convicts were transported by the British government to various prisons around the country. And although these were undoubtedly harsh times, some of the best and most innovative and imaginative rehabilitation ideas were also born. I don't know whether you've heard of Captain Alexander McConaughey. The Australian Psychological Forensic College Prize is named after him. He was, in 1840, the governor of Norfolk Island, which is a small island off the coast of Australia. And it's fair to say that McConaughey revolutionised the criminal justice system of the day. He introduced the idea of indeterminate rather than fixed sentences, implemented a system of rehabilitation in which prisoners earned marks towards early release, and advocated for a system of aftercare and community resettlement. And so many of his ideas were subsequently adopted around the Western world and provide the foundation for the modern parole system. Of course, McConaughey's work in this era is best understood in the context of the great social reformers of 18th century Britain, notably Quakers such as John Howard and Elizabeth Fry. And they were amongst the first to try and change prisons from what they called institutions of deep despair and cruel punishment to places that were more humane and had the potential to reform. John Howard's writings about how prisons produce crime are probably just as relevant today as they were 200 years ago. And his work led to the separation of male and female prisoners, the design of the first prisons to have individual cells, and the introduction of separate juvenile justice systems. Elizabeth Fry is another Quaker. She worked as a volunteer making clothes for the newborn babies of women at Newgate Prison in London. And this led to the setting up of a school inside the prison, which was then expanded to help the women learn to read, write and sew. And prison authorities soon noticed a great improvement in the morale and behaviour of the women, and as a result, reform quickly followed. The reason why I mention these historical figures is that, for me, they remind me of the importance of doing things that might go against the conventions of the day, and how we need to work in ways that are deeply embedded in a set of values, especially when working with those who are disadvantaged or disempowered. They also make me think about the introduction of legislation in Australia, and here I think as well, that defines all psychologists, including forensic psychologists, as allied health practitioners. Gwen Adshead has reminded us of how allied health professionals who work with offenders are always obliged to consider issues of fairness and how to promote client welfare. And yet rehabilitation efforts, certainly in Australia, that explicitly aim to improve the general welfare of offenders are still sometimes dismissed as irrelevant or at worst counterproductive, and other corrections staff can be mistrustful about the purpose of this work. Of course, the conflict that inevitably arises between these broader responsibilities towards community safety and the welfare of the individual client is in many ways a defining feature of all corrections work and forensic work. Specialist guidelines for report writing, such as discussed in these two books, quite rightly make it very clear that we have an overarching duty and obligation to the justice system and the wider community. And it's quite easy to think of occasions when a psychological opinion isn't necessarily in the interest of the person that we're working with or promotes their welfare, such as when it leads to a loss of liberty, mandated treatment, or perhaps the removal of children or the right to see children. And yet we also understand the importance of being able to engage clients in a process of behaviour change if our rehabilitation efforts are to succeed. And this is where specialist forensic psychology training becomes so important. The situation is quite different in Australia these days to how it is in the UK. In Australia, I guess similarly, we saw a massive growth in psychology-based offender rehabilitation about 25 years ago. And that corresponded with the introduction of a large number of new forensic psychology training programmes at both the master's and doctoral levels, which led directly to professional registration. Many of these were developed and designed specifically to equip students with the competencies that they needed to deliver a rehabilitation, and forensic psychology became legally defined as an area of specialist practice. Although I think interest in training in the UK has grown substantially in recent years, the situation in Australia has been quite different, and most of the forensic programmes in Australia have been withdrawn, and there's now only a handful left. This has partly been because of changes to the postgraduate funding formula, which undermined the financial sustainability of all small enrolment courses, but also a result of changes to the funding arrangements, which meant that those in private practice can earn more if they have a specialist qualification in clinical psychology. And so for the college, for the Forensic College, this has forced us to think very carefully about the need for specialist training and the role that forensic psychologists have to play in rehabilitation programmes in the future. A good starting point for me is to try and define what correctional psychology actually is. At the moment, I'm in the process of editing a book with Devon Polishak and Clive Hollin called The Handbook of Correctional Psychology. And this sounded like an interesting and possibly even straightforward project when we started, until we sat down and tried to define what it is that correctional psychology actually involves. The first thing we noticed was the apparent lack of consensus in both the academic and professional literature about who it is we work with. For example, the role's been defined solely in relation to work that occurs in prisons, despite correctional systems having responsibility for the administration of both custodial and community sentences. It's also been defined as applying only to convicted offenders, although correctional agencies have a clear mandate to work with those who are awaiting trial or sentences. Joel Dvoskin, who you may know is a past president of the APLS, has written that the correctional psychologist is typically involved in three main activities: the treatment of mentally disordered offenders and the provision of mental health treatment, offender rehabilitation, and the smooth and safe running of the correction system. Of course, this doesn't accurately reflect what the correctional psychologist does in practice, and surveys have shown that we undertake a myriad of other tasks, including supervision and training of less qualified staff, programme design and evaluation, monitoring of suicidal prisoners, prisoners in segregation, critical incident management, reception screening, cell placement, release planning, and so on and so on. Indeed, in those parts of the world where prisons directly employ their own psychologists, they often take on institutional and management roles that, on the surface at least, have relatively little to do with the type of forensic psychology that we're more familiar with. And so we became aware of just how much training in forensic psychology varies across jurisdictions. And in the US, for example, doctoral level training seems to be the preferred option, with many programmes building on a clinical psychology foundation, with a strong emphasis on the assessment and treatment of mental health. And I think this was the direct result of a series of both state and federal decisions that legally required correctional agencies to improve standards of mental health care. It's not the case here in England and Wales, where I think the accreditation standards for training make relatively little reference to mental health service provision. And so our observation is that although correctional systems around the world have employed psychologists for many years now, it's still difficult to describe any clear international consensus about the role, how we should train new practitioners, and what our ethical responsibilities might look like. And so for me, this suggests that we need to think more broadly about how psychology relates to rehabilitation efforts and how it might inform the wide range of roles that we're often asked to play. If I can put this a slightly different way, and it's probably a provocative thing to say, it makes me wonder if the very diversity of correctional psychology has meant that it's not been able to develop a core theoretical knowledge base of its own, or whether there's a hole at the centre of the enterprise that we need to fill. I'm very grateful to Jason Davis, who's here today, for sending across a reference to this book on correctional psychology that has the same title as ours. It was first published in the US in 1947 and doesn't seem to have been that well received. One reviewer commented that the kindest thing that can be said about the volume is that it's a pioneering venture in an area that's been inadequately explored. More tellingly, the same reviewer goes on to say that in his opinion the book shows that correctional psychology lacks coherence as a discipline, and he argues that the book was too specialised to be used as a text in criminology and too superficial to be used by specialists in penology. And now, over 70 years later, the same questions have come up when we look at modern correctional psychology, even though the contributors to our book are very clearly the leading practitioners and researchers from around the world. And so our conclusion is that there might be two potentially serious but interlinked problems which have limited the development of the discipline. First, there's an absence of a solid conceptual framework to organise bodies of psychological knowledge that are relevant to both policy and practice. And second, it's difficult to demonstrate that much of the work that we do contributes directly to concrete and measurable outcomes that are valued across the justice system. These are probably just different sides of the same coin, but underpin some of the arguments that critics of current approaches to offender rehabilitation have put forward. And you might be familiar with this paper by Teresa Gannon and Tony Ward, when they ask, where has all the psychology gone? And they suggest, I think provocatively, that correctional psychology is in a state of crisis. And they argue that the implementation of R&R principles has led to practice that's far removed from what we know about effective behavioural change. Of course, these are criticisms that aren't unique to psychology. British academic Mark Hardy has made similar observations about how the work of probation and parole officers has come to be dominated by concerns about risk in ways that have eroded traditional social work aims and values. And Hardy goes on to say that in recent years, the balance of the care and control continuum has moved sharply towards control, with practice becoming increasingly punitive and risk-averse and decision-making more cautious and more conservative. So as he puts it, the culture's become one of seeing the worst in people. So for Hardy, at least, professional practice has become de-skilled, and the probation officer is expected to mechanically tick boxes, identify risk factors, and develop case plans based on laundry lists of programmes that are not particularly well suited to the needs of the individual. And he argues that a consequence of this is that pretty much anyone can complete a risk assessment or develop a view about risk based on the simple identification of risk factors, and as a result, more sophisticated assessments are not always considered to be necessary. To my mind, although these critics, I think, rather significantly overstate the problems that we face, they do require a response. And I think it requires us to be much more explicit about the theoretical basis of our practice and the values that underpin it, and encourage us to think more about the logical connections that exist between our assessment and treatment activities and the correctional outcomes that we're aiming to achieve. I think that this will allow us to better enact professional practice as a thoughtful, analytic and creative activity which defends the interests of our clients. And of course, this is exactly what most prison psychologists do on a daily basis. However, I want to move on now to talk about an area where I think the hole in the centre of the enterprise has been startlingly obvious in relation to the status of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australian prisons. Although there are considerable regional variations, overall Indigenous people make up about 3% of the general population, the general adult population, but over 27% of the prison population. And so in some parts of the country, nearly all prisoners are Indigenous, and these statistics aren't changing despite considerable efforts and investment in rehabilitation. It's not a problem, of course, that's unique to Australia, and most people will have some awareness of figures like these, which show that Indigenous people from both Canada and New Zealand are also grossly overrepresented in terms of imprisonment and community sentences when their relative presence in the general population is taken into account. We have particular concern at the moment about the overrepresentation of young people in the justice system. And in South Australia, for example, Aboriginal children make up around 50% of all 10 to 17-year-olds in detention, but less than 5% of this age group in the total population. So the question for me is, how should we understand these statistics, and what does it mean for how we should provide rehabilitation? These are two quotes from the criminologist Chris Cunneen, which for me illustrate how the over-incarceration of young people in particular is sometimes viewed as a consequence of Australian social policy. Cunneen's referring here to the stolen generation, the forcible removal of Indigenous children from their families between 1910 and 1970 as part of a government policy of cultural assimilation. Thousands of children were taken from their parents. They were taught to reject their Indigenous heritage and forced to adopt white culture. Their names were often changed and they were forbidden to speak traditional language. Many were placed in institutions where abuse and neglect were common. And so Indigenous explanations for overrepresentation rarely make any reference to what we talk about as criminogenic needs. And they're more often framed around three things: historical and structural conditions of colonisation, social and economic marginalisation, and differential criminal justice treatment, or systemic racism. So in essence, prisons are viewed by many in the community as part of a concerted and continuing effort to destroy cultural values and practices. I think it's interesting. I mean, when I first moved to Australia and started working in the area, I thought that these were rather extreme positions on the purpose of prisons. But over time, I've come to appreciate just how important it is to understand why people would see them in this way, even if we don't agree with them, and try to think about what this means for the provision of more humane and effective rehabilitation services. The first implication relates to how we should conceptualise dynamic risk and criminogenic need. And there are several consequences of overrepresentation, at least in some communities, that we rarely consider in our current programmes. First, it can mean the prison's perceived in some communities as being accepted, expected and normalised. And there's a cascading risk associated with growing up in regular contact with the justice system in communities where most family members and peers are or have been incarcerated. This can result in a distortion of social norms, where prison becomes a social institution or part of a normative pattern of expectations and behaviours. In other words, an anticipated life event or a rite of passage that's socially endorsed. In addition, some of the normal everyday processes of interacting with family members are lost, making it difficult for the offenders to establish and maintain meaningful relationships with those outside of the system, and thus reducing their opportunities to lead a fulfilling life. This is a list that we came up with of common or possibly common culture-related criminogenic needs, which again aren't considered routinely in our current assessment tools and treatment programmes. I think it begins to highlight the psychological impact of social and environmental drivers of crime, and the things that I think we can and should address better in our rehabilitation programmes. So they include things like exposure to intergenerational violence and a lack of positive role models. And the list also suggests to me that issues related to risk are likely to be difficult to address without understanding the impact of a range of other experiences, including child protection issues and social and economic disadvantage. And so what lists like this do, I think, in my view anyway, is help us to develop a theory of crime that's specific to the understanding risk in a particular population. And they help us to identify some of the causal mechanisms by which offending occurs. And it's this that can help us to develop the type of case formulations that can only improve the effectiveness of our interventions. And so this might help us to formulate risk in a different way. And this slide illustrates what a cross-cultural case formulation for an Indigenous person might look like. And the difference here is really one of emphasis. So the focus is very much on social relationships and social context, as it is on individual cognition and emotion. Of course, Tony Ward has also argued, I think persuasively, that dynamic risk factors, or at least in their current form, can't be coherently conceptualised as causal mechanisms for offending. And if he were wrong, we'd expect significant change in dynamic risk to translate directly into reductions in reoffending. And yet strong evidence for this simply doesn't exist. There have been 2 recent comprehensive reviews which have concluded that whilst there is evidence that change in dynamic risk factors does occur in the expected direction in most of our programmes, this doesn't translate directly into behaviour change. And this has certainly been our experience across a number of programme evaluations and challenges, for me, the very logic that underpins current treatment models. Concerns about the validity of the methods we use to understand risk have also been raised, but in a different way by the judiciary in cases involving Aboriginal defendants. And in Western Australia, the Director of Public Prosecutions, v Manglamara, was the first of a number of cases in which the weight given to risk assessment evidence was questioned. And so in this case, the judge concluded that the Static 99 didn't take adequate account of the social circumstances of Indigenous Australians in remote communities, and went on to express his reservations as to whether the defendant fitted into the proposed risk categories. You might have heard of this case, which is a more recent case, which has just been finalised, I think, late last year, which is a landmark case, a Canadian court case, Hewitt versus Canada, similarly with an Aboriginal defendant. And in the initial hearing, the judge concluded that a number of violence risk assessment tools that we use, the PCL, the VRAG, the SORAG, the Static 99, the VRS, didn't meet the legal standards of expert evidence. So although it's important to note that the Hewitt ruling was subsequently overturned on appeal, it raised significant questions about the susceptibility of all of our tools to cultural bias. So these cases draw attention to the potential for even the most commonly used tools to be compromised by cultural difference, although we can also ask questions about their use with other non-dominant cultural groups, with older and younger offenders, with female offenders, and across different offence types. Stephen Shepherd has pointed out that questions arise really relating to the underlying properties of the instruments themselves, their item content, and the impact, potentially at least, of evaluator bias. And underlying these questions is the bigger issue of why our instruments continue to produce varying scores across cultural groups. There's also a more general concern about whether population-level classification systems inevitably disadvantage those from minority groups. And I've been reminded here of the arguments of the BPS Clinical Psychology Division when it put forward its position paper for the reformulation of DSM-4. So this slide's taken directly from that paper. And I think it's interesting to think about how many of the points that they make about diagnosis and classification might also apply to the process that we use that drive offender rehabilitation. Categories such as high risk are used in many ways in a similar way to that of diagnosis, and often has far-reaching effects on the way in which someone is then managed. The second issue the DCP raised with DSM is the impact that the diagnosis has on service users. And some of the key concerns here are around the potential for discrimination, and the danger of stigmatisation and the negative impact on identity is perhaps self-evident, but an important one is marginalising knowledge from lived experience by undervaluing the significance of the practical, material, interpersonal and social aspects of client experience. And disempowerment, where offenders become dependent on expert advice and treatment rather than assume agency for their behaviour. And so I think the BPS position paper draws attention for the need for us all to develop approaches that are more multifactorial, that contextualise distress and acknowledge the complexity of the interactions that are involved in human experience. And for me, this is something that lies at the very heart of successful rehabilitation and effective psychological practice. Of course, it also brings me back to my earlier question about whether there's a hole at the centre of the enterprise and the need for us to be much clearer about our core theoretical knowledge base and the values that guide our practice. And many of these problems seem to arise because our tools have been developed actuarially in ways that are largely divorced from any meaningful understanding of the local drivers of risk. And so even if we disagree with some of the more sociological and criminological explanations of offending, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders at least, they clearly have something to offer in terms of guiding our rehabilitation efforts. We might expect correctional services in Australia to be investing heavily in the development of approaches that acknowledge community perspectives on the drivers of crime and have better prospects of acceptance. But with few notable exceptions, this hasn't been the case. And in fact, all states and territories still subscribe to what's essentially an individual pathology model of crime that identifies risk as something that's largely located in the individual. Their focus has been on, I think, as it has everywhere around the world, been on refining and implementing risk assessment and case management tools and providing group offence-focused treatment to moderate and high-risk offenders. I think it's also fair to say that psychologists have put relatively little effort into understanding and appreciating the local knowledge, perceptions, practices which are seen by the Aboriginal community as a prerequisite for the development of effective and legitimate interventions. And of course, this translates for many Indigenous offenders into low levels of engagement with mainstream rehabilitation, and as a result, offenders simply vote with their feet, so they choose not to engage and not turn up for programmes at all, and that disadvantages them in their journey through the justice system. So I think what we probably need are some new frameworks and ways of talking about rehabilitation that promote alternative ways of working, and there are a number of these around that we can learn from. Perhaps the first and the most obvious would be the Good Lives kind of model, and I think that's clearly helped us to think more carefully about the role that social and emotional well-being might play in successful rehabilitation. And when I read the Good Lives model, I think very much about its impact on social and emotional well-being. And this is a term used by the World Health Organization to describe the idea that mental health is a state of well-being defined by awareness of the ability to cope with stresses and make a positive contribution to the community. It's regarded as a particularly culturally appropriate construct in the Australian context, insofar as it reflects a holistic philosophy that many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have, and is closely associated with the impacts of a wide range of negative life events that are often experienced. Important and probably common consequences of exposure to these are things like low levels of personal well-being, complex feelings of shame and loneliness, fear and boredom that often act as key emotional antecedents to reoffending. Work in the area of public health also has some interesting implications for developing, I think, new rehabilitation approaches. Statistical models have, for example, been developed that separately estimate the impact of demographic factors, social determinants and behavioural risk factors on the health gap that exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And these show that social determinants are responsible for nearly 1/3 of the gap, compared with only around 10% for behavioural risk factors, and that interactions between the two explain an additional 15%. So overall, this type of methodology I think can help us understand more about the overlap and interaction that exists between environmental and psychological risk for reoffending and where our efforts might be best placed. I also think it suggests a move to what Fox has called personalised care, and she argues that the justice system can learn much from reforms to the social care system that have occurred over the last 10 or 15 years, particularly in how it's learned to respond to those who have multiple and complex needs. The focus in this sector is now much less on institutional care and more on promoting independent living and well-being. And yet, once again, our current forensic assessment tools and intervention programmes have probably not integrated these developments in any meaningful way. And finally, in criminology, the desistance literature has a lot to say about the social determinants of crime. It tells us very clearly from the perspective of prisoners and ex-offenders what's required to reduce future offending, and highlights the importance of what's sometimes referred to as social capital, or the development of connections between people, social ties and civil society. And underpinning the desistance approach is the need to listen very carefully to what offenders have to say about their rehabilitation needs. I like to understand the process of desistance in relation to these three simple levels described by Fergus McNeill. At the level of primary desistance, behaviour is the target, that's the act of staying away from crime. And targeting primary desistance involves moving the offender along the road to an offence-free period by promoting increased awareness of offence-related needs, attitudes and behaviours. And it also involves identifying and exploring strengths that the person already possesses. And I think we probably do this rather well in most of our current programmes, especially when we focus on strengthening some of the positive aspects of self. At the level of secondary desistance, McNeill suggests that rehabilitation should be designed to provide opportunities for offenders to see themselves in ways that are less compatible with the criminal lifestyle. And so for him, this leads to the development of agency and generativity and provides opportunities for successful practice. So this might include things like supporting activities that bring increased demands for responsibility, reliability and commitment. For example, employment programmes can lead offenders to taking a sense of pride in their work and helps them to address a range of things, including the stigma that they might experience as they learn to fulfil pro-social roles and the responsibilities that are attached to the roles. The third and final level of desistance, I think it's an interesting one. It's one that targets the interaction between the offender and the community. And intervening at this level involves creating opportunities to engage with the community in ways that are positive, supportive and reciprocal. So the aim of any intervention here is for the person to feel a sense of belonging and for the community to develop acceptance. So for me, from my observations of programmes in Australia, while we're probably quite good at understanding the types of behaviour change that indicate primary desistance, we think less often about how we might assess changes to identity that characterise secondary desistance. And there are even bigger challenges associated with efforts to support tertiary desistance, or how we can best support our clients to rejoin what they call a moral community. Okay, so I'm talking about all of this in Bristol. And I'm aware that some of this might seem quite far removed from the realities of offender rehabilitation in the UK. But the point I want to make is that, in my view, the challenge facing any correctional psychology is how we can best understand individuals in their context. I don't think this is something that we've generally been very successful in, and our broad alignment with a clinical treatment model has probably led to an overly narrow conceptualisation of offender needs. And the example for me of how our efforts to rehabilitate Indigenous offenders in Australia have not led to reductions in rates of reoffending or overall representation, I think illustrates this very well. And so whilst we've learned a lot about the treatment of individual attitudes and beliefs that support offending and how we can improve emotional regulation, it seems to me that locating risk as something that resides primarily in an individual is not likely to be sufficient. And so I wanted to return to my two original questions about how rehabilitation in the correctional setting might seek to position itself in the future. I think clearly we always need to think critically about how to improve the quality and effectiveness of the programmes that we deliver. And whilst we already know quite a lot about those interventions that are likely to be successful, there's much more work to be done in developing more socially embedded rehabilitation. And many of the ideas that coming out from work in other disciplines, such as health and public health, criminology, can be readily accommodated within our practice. Thinking more about cross-cultural issues in the forensic setting, I think inevitably requires us to think more about the social determinants of risk in the communities in which our clients come from and will return to. I want to briefly also return to the idea that we should listen much more carefully to our clients when we develop our rehabilitation responses. The importance of this was highlighted last year in the Indigenous psychology context, when on the 15th of September, the Australian Psychological Society issued a formal apology to all members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The apology acknowledged that psychologists have for many years been responsible for developing and applying treatments that have dismissed the importance of culture and made a commitment to training the next generation of psychologists differently. This commitment involves listening more and talking less, following more and steering less, and collaborating more and commanding less. And it notes, I think importantly, that our ability to stay present when listening to those who are not like ourselves is particularly important to our effectiveness. And so in short, the apology sets an agenda for the development of a new approach to professional practice, which is based on the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to have control over psychological services. And I think our task is to develop this in the area of correctional psychology. And so for me, my own answers to the questions I posed about how to improve rehabilitation practice involves me reflecting more on what it would mean to my effectiveness if I decided to listen more and to talk less, and if I decided to collaborate more and command less. I wonder just how much it would change the way in which rehabilitation is delivered and received. In the correctional setting, where our goals typically focus on the management of risk and the need to improve community safety, offender preferences aren't always highly valued, and I suspect that we consult relatively rarely with offenders when we write new programmes. Nonetheless, I think we'll be better placed to integrate what happens within the group therapy room to the circumstances which offenders return to after their release. We listen very carefully to what they have to say about their rehabilitation needs. As commentators in clinical psychology have argued, the needs of service users should be much more central in all of the work that we do. Lucy Johnson has said that instead of asking what's wrong with you or how much risk you carry in our context, we need to ask what's happened. And once we know this, we can draw on psychological evidence to show how life events and the sense that people make of them lead to their current difficulties. And this, of course, is what psychologists do the best. It also reminds me of our responsibilities as allied health professionals to attend seriously to issues of well-being and work positively with all of our clients to achieve these goals. This is a poster from the Singapore Prison Service, which suggests that we should always try to see the best in people and find ways to help them flourish. It's on display for all staff and prisoners to see at all times. I think there's also a need to think very seriously about local community-based solutions to offending. This is a map that shows that there are around 600 culturally distinctive Aboriginal communities in Australia, all of which would regard themselves as different from each other. And it highlights, I think, to me, how we need place-based solutions and different programs that are designed to meet local needs rather than imported in from other settings or even other countries, as often happens. A general suggestion, though, is to think about how we consider the impact of social circumstances in our case formulations. And in an important sense, I think rehabilitation and reintegration shouldn't be seen as separate areas of activity. And our goal should be to provide truly integrated approaches that address both the social and the psychological. In practice, this might encourage us to work more closely with a wide range of pre- and post-release programs and services that are currently available. For example, we currently seem to do relatively little work with families of prisoners or in preparing ex-prisoners to find employment, and it seems plausible to me at least that it'll be at the interface between rehabilitation and reintegration where we can have most impact. I wanted to finish up though by making it absolutely clear that I'm not suggesting we throw the baby out with the bathwater. In fact, we've learned so much about how to rehabilitate over the last 40 years, and we know so much more about the drivers of risk than we ever used to. This is a quote from Stan Brodsky that suggests that we should all feel more optimistic about the future of correctional psychology now than perhaps at any stage in the past. I guess my point is that this will be particularly true if we can integrate some of our understandings of the interpersonal, social and cultural domains within our practice. And ultimately, I think this can only help us to develop a more humane, ethical and above all, effective approach to rehabilitation and confirm why it's so important to rehabilitate rather than to punish. I also very much like this quote from John Gannon, who reminds us of just how much psychology is the foundation discipline for pretty much everything that goes on in the criminal justice system. Well, let me finish with one final quote, and this one's from Armin Tamatea. Armin's a New Zealand correctional psychologist and academic with Maori heritage. Armin makes the point that in an important sense, forensic psychological practice is more than a matter of statistical accuracy and even good clinical decision making, but also a matter of social justice. For me, it's forensic psychologists more than perhaps any other professional group who lead the way in applying evidence and ethics to improving social justice in our prisons and our communities. And that's probably the note that I want to finish. So many thanks for your time this morning, and I hope you're enjoying the conference.